Grateful that God has granted us another opportunity to come together as like-minded individuals and to peer into His Word. Thank you for being here tonight. We worked our way through a portion of the book of Genesis last evening, and now we continue in about chapter 37. I mentioned last night that the rest of this book is focused on primarily a single son of Jacob. Why would God do that? And I suggested to you that being a type of Christ, Joseph was the means through whom God perpetuated the seed line that would eventually bring Christ into the world. So keep in mind the Bible, though a history book, is not merely about history. It is divulging to the human race the great scheme of redemption that God formulated in His mind in eternity, and then worked out through 4,000 years of human history. And you and I are beneficiaries of that great plan. Well, do you remember Jacob had 12 sons and one daughter? And you remember that the firstborn son of Rachel, Joseph, was not appreciated by his brothers. And you can understand why. Jacob showed favoritism, parental partiality. Parents ought not to do that. It engenders jealousy, rivalry, and ill will. And Jacob certainly did that. I mean, I understand that this was the son of really the only woman he really wanted to marry to begin with. But he should not have showered upon the boy special gifts that he didn't give the other brothers, like that multicolored tunic that he bestowed upon Joseph. And as if that were not enough, God empowered Joseph to interpret dreams. You know, I don't think he does that today. I believe the age of miracles is past for a very specific reason given in Scripture. But he permitted it at that time, and all miracles throughout the Bible serve the singular purpose of confirming the oral expression of God's Word, to demonstrate that the spokesman was in fact a bona fide spokesman for God. Well, you remember he had dreams that appeared to put his brothers in subservience to him, and he made the mistake, I think, of telling them. I don't know that he was, that sort of attitude, but whatever it was, he may have simply been wanting to inform them how odd it was that he was receiving this information, but they did not appreciate it. Jacob himself was irritated because even the father would bow down. And so that only stimulated more resentment toward Joseph, and all of that really came to a head. You remember when 10 of the brothers were out on family business, a good distance from home, and Jacob, I suppose, became concerned about their whereabouts and their safety, and so he told Joseph, I want you to go check on your brothers and see if they're okay. So off he left home wearing that multicolored tunic, and he went in the direction where they were to have traveled, which was ultimately in the area of Shechem, where a very ugly, dark incident occurred in this section of the Bible. And you remember when he arrived there, he couldn't find him. He was wandering around out in the open field looking lost, and one of the townspeople saw this teenage boy. Remember, he's a teenager. And he goes over to him and says, who are you looking for? And he told him, I'm looking for my brothers. And the man said, well, they were here. And I overheard one of them say that they were going on toward Dothan. Shechem's a good 50 or 60 miles from their home, and this would have been an additional 10 miles further away. So off he went in that direction. In the meantime, the brothers look off in the distance and see him coming toward them. And before he arrives, one of the brothers said, look, here comes the dreamer, referring to the dreams that he had had about him. He said, let's kill him, and we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Well, the oldest brother, Reuben, intervened and said, fellas, let's not kill our own brother and be responsible for shedding his blood. Instead, let's put him in this cistern, a dry well. The implication there is that he will die of natural causes. They won't be responsible for directly killing him. But the Bible tells us that what was in Reuben's mind was, I'm going to sneak around later, retrieve the boy, and get him back safely home to his dad. Well, you remember Joseph arrived in their midst. They treated him with cruel hands. They stripped that multicolored tunic off of him, threw him in the pit, and then sat down to have a meal. Off in the distance from the north, they saw a caravan coming in their direction, headed southerly toward Egypt. And it was a trade caravan that dealt in a number of commercial articles, one of which was human flesh, slavery. And so one of the brothers popped off and said, hey, let's sell him. There the idea is we'll be rid of him and make money too. And that's something that the brothers agreed to. And so when the caravan arrived, they pulled their brother up out of that pit, sold their own brother for 20 paltry pieces of silver. Off the caravan went toward the south, toward Egypt. The Bible doesn't tell us where Reuben was when that transaction was made, but he was not present. When he returned from wherever he had gone, he went to the pit and realized what his brothers had done. He tore his clothes, so typical of Oriental grief, and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? The brothers decided to concoct a story to tell their dad. So they took animal blood, put it on that coat that they had taken from their brother, toward the coat, to make it appear as if he had been attacked and perhaps devoured by a wild animal. They took it back home, laid it before their father, and allowed him to draw the false conclusion that his favored son, his treasured son, had been killed and was no more. Jacob entered into a period of mourning that was so intense and so sustained that it literally endangered his health and his life. Have you ever known someone to mourn that deeply, grieve that much? There have been parents who have lost, a 2-year-old. Maybe they backed up and drove the car over the child. Some very tragic circumstances that was such that they were so heartbroken. In fact, I've known people in history who have died from the grieving process over loved ones. Well, his children gathered around him and tried to encourage him, but he was absolutely in a state of deep distress, and he refused to be comforted despite all of their efforts. Well, in the meantime, we are informed that Joseph was taken by that caravan down into Egypt, placed on the auction block, and sold into the home of one of Pharaoh's court officials. In your translation, the word officer is a term in the original language that refers to a eunuch. A eunuch, this is so odd to the American mind, but a eunuch is a person who has been surgically rendered sexually inactive. And there were reasons in antiquity. This was very common throughout the ancient world. There were reasons for that, generally because it involved people that would come into close contact with the royal family or had access to circumstances. And so they were willing to make that sacrifice in order to rise to a considerable position and be well taken care of in their lifetime. Well, that term is used to refer to this man. Well, I wonder if that doesn't perhaps explain the conduct of his wife. Now, keep in mind that Joseph's approaching manhood, and the Bible describes him as a very handsome young fellow. But on a number of occasions, Potiphar's wife made sexual advances toward him. And it's absolutely incredible that this boy at that age and in those circumstances, he's not home. He doesn't have his father overlooking him. He's away from his country, his culture, everything that's familiar to him. Initially, he can't even speak the language. And here this woman offers herself to him. I don't suppose there's very many young fellows that would have refused, but he did. And we know why he did. The Bible gives us insight. What was in his mind? What was motivating and driving this young fellow who had been treated so severely by his own kin? Well, on one of those occasions when she came on to him, chapter 39, verse 9, he made the statement, "How could I commit this great wickedness and sin against God?" That tells you where he's coming from. He wasn't afraid particularly of Potiphar or any other ramifications. This boy had religious, moral values. Don't we desperately need those today in our country among all ranks and facets of life and age groups? This boy was sufficiently connected to God and believed in the God of the Bible and believed in the principles that God has given to all of us, that he was able to curb his appetites and resist this woman. Absolutely astounding. Well, you remember on one of those occasions when she came on to him, this time he literally did what Paul told the Corinthians to do. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 16. Flee fornication. He literally ran from her. She had caught him indoors alone. All the other workers were outdoors. And so he ran, and she reached out and grabbed for him. I suspect spurned once too often, and grabbed a hold of his outer tunic, and he felt the tug, and he just kind of let it come off, and he literally hightailed it outdoors. And she was not pleased about that, and so that night when her husband came home, she made up this story and accused him and said he came on to me, even implying perhaps rape. And Potiphar believed her and had Joseph consigned to prison. Now think about that. You've been sold by your own brothers into slavery, into a foreign culture, traumatized. And here he is functioning in a slave capacity, and yet so conducted himself that Potiphar put him in charge of the entire state. And then he's falsely accused and lands in prison. And once again, to show you what he was made of, he continued to conduct himself properly. You know, it's so easy for us to become resentful. I don't deserve this. Why did this happen to me in life? And we get kind of cop an attitude, maybe blame it on God. We never are justified in doing that. We're in a world where all kinds of things happen to everybody. God tells us it does. He promises us that he'll be with us through whatever adversity we have to face, but we're not going to be exempt from it because we're Christians. If anything, we'll have more of it. Because Satan wants us. Look what he did to Job. Satan did that to Job. And you don't think he'll do it to you too? The more you're determined to stay faithful, the more tests and opportunities of temptation will come your way. And he sure had them. And yet there in prison, he so conducted himself in such an honorable fashion that the prison warden placed him in charge of other prisoners, a very special group of prisoners that were individuals who had been in the former employ of Pharaoh himself. But because of infractions, they had been consigned to prison. And one morning Joseph walked in, and here were two of these fellows, we call them the butler and the baker, sitting there, both of them looking very despondent, gloomy, sad. And so Joseph speaks to the butler. This word is the word that refers in antiquity to cupbearers. Those were individuals who were associated with the monarch in such a way that they would screen the liquids that would be given to Pharaoh, kind of a poison taster. Probably not the best job that you might want, but highly trusted post. I mean, Pharaoh had to rely on that fellow. But he had done something to be banned to prison. And so Joseph said, why are you looking so sad today? What's the matter? And he said, I've had a dream that's causing me grief. And Joseph says, well, you know, listen to this. Here, look at this evangelistic attitude. There's a God. And he's empowered me to interpret dreams. Tell me what you dream. And so he related the details of it. And you remember Joseph said, well, your dream means that within 3 days you're going to be reinstated in your courtly capacity before Pharaoh. And you remember what he then said? He said, will you please remember, when that happens, will you please remember me sitting down here in prison? I didn't do anything to deserve any of this. Well, the old baker's sitting over there listening to this, and so he speaks up and says, well, I've had a dream too. But after revealing the contents of that dream, Joseph sadly has to inform him, your dream means that within 3 days you are going to be executed. And the terminology is by some form of impalement. Well, at the end of 3 days, both of those dreams came true. The baker was executed, the butler was reinstated before Pharaoh, and the Bible informs us that he promptly forgot about Joseph. That's something. Joseph had already been in prison. for a good while, and he had to sit there an additional 2 full years. Providence of God is incredible, the way it operates. If you're devoted to God and determined to be loyal no matter what, you'll go through some hard times, and yet there's light at the end of the tunnel. Time's not a big thing with God. It is more to us. But if we stay in there, He's looking down on us. He knows our situation, our predicament. Well, at the end of that time, I guess Joseph would have continued to sit in prison, except Pharaoh himself had dreams. He began to summon out of his empire all those individuals that claimed to be able to deal in those matters. We have those in America today more than ever before, as our nation moves further and further and further away from God, away from Christianity, then the more you would expect the vacuum to be filled by all sorts of nonsense. Eastern religion, for example. What about astrology? That really kicked in the 60s, and witchcraft and fortune tellers, What about, remember the psychic hotline where you could call that? And apparently over these telephone lines there were psychic vibrations that would let the person on the other end of the line know what your financial future was and your love life. How many Americans believe that stuff? There's channels that have this ghost thing where they're going searching for ghosts and stuff like that. See, the more people are attuned to the God of the Bible and informed about what the Bible teaches, the less susceptible they are to that kind of mysticism. Well, may I suggest to you that everywhere, Old and New Testament, where the Bible addresses this matter, of individuals that claim, black magic, and there are a number of terms that are used in both the Old and the New Testament, rendered in our English versions by a number of words like, enchanter and sorcerer and medium, and this woman that was claimed to be able to do that sort of thing at Endor when Saul supposedly allowed her to summon Samuel from beyond the grave. She's described in some translations as a witch. Well, there's a number of these terms that are used in the Bible. And they are always, when God comments on the matter, it's always the same. How about chapter 21, verse 8 of Revelation, where one of the terms is used to describe those who will spend their eternity in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. Why? Well, not only because it's fake, but because it represents an alternative approach to life. You and I have been given everything we need, all things that pertain to life and godliness, 2 Peter 1:3. So why would we resort to something like that? There's no value there for us. It's essentially an alternative religion. It's a false religion. Now here is Egypt at essentially the zenith of its great achievements, its accomplishments, its standing in the world. You would think out of all of those individuals that are on the payroll, somebody could have helped him. But they couldn't. And he was not pleased, but that's when the butler spoke up and said, I have been remiss. There was a fellow in prison a couple of years ago that interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and they came true exactly as he said. Pharaoh said, you get him out here. So they went to the prison system to retrieve Joseph, and to show you something of the conditions in prisons in those days, they had to give him a shave and put more new clothes on him. And you go to the prison system today and you'd probably just say, shut off your air conditioner and you can't lift weights today. Come on, and I need to take you somewhere. Well, that's not the prisons of antiquity. They were like dungeons. He endured hardship and suffering in such an environment. They cleaned him up and stood him before that Egyptian monarch. And Pharaoh said, I understand you can help me. And once again, Joseph showing who he was. He said, no, there is a God. Well, the Egyptians believed in many gods. Many gods. So here's Joseph saying, nah, there's one God. In fact, 5 times in this interaction with Pharaoh, he refers to the God of the Bible. And he explains to him that God has enabled me. It's not within me, but God has empowered me to interpret these dreams. So, what did you dream? And you remember Pharaoh related how he had really had 2 different dreams, one involving cows, both fat and lean, and one involving heads of grain, both thin and full. And Joseph said, well, it's the same dream. This is the same message that God is sending to you. Let me tell you what it means. It means that for the next 7 years, 7 throughout the ancient world was the complete, perfect number. It's not coincidental that 7 pops up all over the place in the Bible. For example, in the book of Revelation, which is a self-declared apocalyptic book, loaded with figurative terminology, the number 7 is used 54 times. So for the next 7 years, there will be this period of unparalleled agricultural productivity. The land will give off bountifully. And at the end of that 7-year period, another 7-year period will set in. This will be one of deprivation, famine, hardship. And what you need to do is appoint a prime minister during the 7-year period of plenty and have him mobilize the empire to collect all of the surplus produce and store it in order to prepare for the 7-year period of deprivation. And that pagan monarch said, well, who would be a better man for that job than this one in whom the Spirit of God resides? That was true. So at that moment, he elevated this foreigner, convict, slave to what was essentially the top political post of the Egyptian empire. Pharaoh said, I'm not relinquishing the throne, but I am turning over the control of the country, the nation, the empire to you. In fact, he took off of his hand, Pharaoh did, the royal signet ring. That's the ring in antiquity that could be used to authenticate governmental decrees and send them forth with all the authority of the throne behind them. He dressed Joseph in royal Egyptian regalia, put a gold chain around his neck. He placed him in the second chariot. That's the one that rides, beside, perhaps slightly behind Pharaoh himself. I mean, he was elevated to this unbelievable position of power in this ancient pagan empire. He's 30 years old at this point of his life. Think about that. He's gone through some rough times. And if you don't think so, think about the fact that during those 7 years, he met and married an Egyptian girl, and they were blessed with 2 sons. The day the first little boy was born, Joseph named him Manasseh. That's the Hebrew name. It means one who causes to forget. Why would you name your firstborn son forgetting? He tells us, God is allowing me to forget. And then he uses a word rendered in King James, I think, toil. It could have just as easily been rendered my distress, my hardship, my suffering, my trauma. So this boy has been traumatized by what he's been through. And God is enabling me to forget, listen to this, my father's house. Oh, you see, now we know that all those years, this boy has been tortured by memories of dad and home. He didn't get to finish his childhood. He was literally ripped from his childhood by his mean brothers and thrust into this foreign, unfriendly environment where he had to literally endure years of hardship and suffering and survival. And he's so traumatized by all of that, so scarred by the hard knocks of life, that he names his firstborn son Forgetting. Now maybe I can start to forget what I've been through. And then when the second child was born, he named him Ephraim. We say Ephraim. And there the concept is that God is allowing me to be fruitful. That's the meaning of the word. Productive. In the land, listen to this, of my affliction. Now, wait a minute, Joseph. You're the prime minister of the entire Egyptian empire. You call this the land of your affliction? You can go anywhere and do anything you want. But that's what he calls it. The land of my affliction. Well, during that 7-year period of plenty, he conducted himself in high fashion, as you would expect him to, as he had been doing up to this point. He mobilized the nation. He made provision for an empire to stockpile surplus. Those 7 years were good agricultural years, very productive, and enabled them to stockpile not only enough for the 7-year period of deprivation for the entire Egyptian population, but even additional for other countries that would come and seek assistance. Well, finally, that 7-year period of famine set in. About 2 years into it, the tentacles of this famine had stretched far to the north and reached way up into Palestine, endangering the Israelite people. And one day Jacob called in his sons, and he said, we're nearly at the end of our ability to care for ourselves. I need you to go down into Egypt, load up with provisions, take sufficient funding, and go down into Egypt and purchase supplies so that we can survive this famine. And so in obedience to their father's command, they loaded up and off they went. And they arrived in Egypt, and they came to the governmental distribution facility, and they were ushered into the presence of the prime minister himself, their own brother, whom they do not recognize. Why would that be? Well, number one, this is the last person they expected to see in that kind of position, right? Not only that, he's fully enculturated. He's an Egyptian. He's dressed in royal Egyptian regalia. He speaks Egyptian fluently. He still remembers Hebrew, but he doesn't speak to his brothers directly. He speaks through an interpreter. He speaks Egyptian, who then turns around and tells them in Hebrew. Not only that, look how many years it's been. Last time they saw him, he was a teenager. He's now pushing 40 years of age. He's middle-aged. Do you look the same at middle age that you did as a teenager? Go back and look at your high school annual if you want to know about that. You'll see your name under somebody else's picture, right? And I've seen people after a number of years, 20 years, and I wouldn't have recognized them just seeing them out somewhere if I hadn't been told who they were. We undergo physical change. But you know what? They didn't recognize him, but he instantly recognized them. And all of those years of pent-up resentment, frustration, emotion, and anger came welling up within him. And he just blurted out, "You are spies." Now imagine their reaction. What? No, we're not. Yes, you are spies. You have come down here to investigate our vulnerabilities. And I mean, they start talking fast. No, sir, we're all the sons of one man. There were 12 of us. One of us is not. That was Joseph. And one of us is still at home with our dad. I'm confident at that moment, Joseph's mind turned to the identity of that one boy who was too young to accompany them. It was his one and only full-blooded brother, Benjamin. Rachel only had 2 kids, remember? Remember how he came into the world? Rachel was unable to have children for many years of marriage. But finally God granted her pleas, and she was able to have Joseph. She must have been elated when she was able to become pregnant a second time. When time for the delivery drew near, the family was caught out on a trip in between towns. And ordinarily, that would not have been necessarily a dangerous situation because midwives traveled with the family caravans in those days. But in this particular case, look how specific God is. The Holy Spirit is he shows specificity and detail in the way he describes things. When she went into labor, the Bible describes it as hard labor. So that's life-threatening. That's the kind of labor that women die in childbirth from. And so in that condition, as she was striving to give birth to this little baby boy, she was able to do so. And yet, as she was, the text says, as her spirit was exiting her body. There's a good biblical description of human life. We have a physical, fleshly body that is not us. We are inhabiting our bodies. Our spirits will transcend our bodies and live on into eternity. Our bodies will not. As her spirit was exiting her body, she named the little boy Ben-Oni. In Hebrew, that means son of my distress. And then she died. Now, you know that Jacob did not want that name to stick and forever be reminded of the death of his wife in giving birth to that son. So he changed his name from Ben-Oni to Ben-Yamin, Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. Son of my right hand. So when these mean, cruel brothers come down there into Egypt and say, well, there's still one of our brothers at home trying to prove who they are, Joseph immediately remembers that's my little brother, who, by the way, had nothing to do with landing him in Egypt. He would have been too young at the time. So it's clear to me that he instantly concocts this plan. I want to get my little brother down here to be with me. He doesn't even seem to show interest in seeing his dad again. He's upset with his dad. Don't you know when he was sold off into that caravan and came to the first night's campfire on their way to Egypt? He must have been sitting there, probably chained or in some way bound, and yearning to hear through the darkness, maybe his father coming to rescue him. You know, his dad was a rich man, and that's not that far from Egypt. You would think sooner or later my dad's going to find me. He's going to come and rescue me. How many weeks, how many months, how many years would go by before you would give up? And then harbor resentment to his father. But he wants to see his little brother. So here's the plan. I'm going to let you guys take the provisions you came for. Well, I'll let all of you go back except one. One of you I'm going to hold hostage. In order for me to verify your story, to determine whether you are true men telling me the truth, I'm going to let the rest of you go back with the provisions you came for, but you are not to come back down here and show your face in Egypt again unless you bring that alleged brother you claim to have. Pretty good plan, right? Not interested in them being there, but he wants to see that brother. So here's a way to coerce them into doing that. Well, you remember they went back home, and I just see that screen door fly open, hit the wall, and they said, Dad, you're not going to believe what's happened. When we were there in Egypt, the prime minister accused us of being spies, espionage, and sent us back and said that we are to retrieve Benjamin and take him back down in there in order to, by the way, before I tell you that, I left out one little piece. After telling them that he was going to hold one of them hostage, he just stopped and threw all of them into prison. See, this is built up, pin-up anger. Throws them all into prison. Leaves them there 3 days. And then on the third day, lets them come back out. Look, you know, I want to do what's right, so I'm only going to hold one of you hostage. Well, as they're there, they begin talking amongst themselves, not knowing that he can understand what they're saying. And they speak up, and here's what they said. We are very guilty concerning our brother. Talking about Joseph. We saw the anguish of his spirit. The King James says, when he besought us. All right, notice the terminology there. They're talking about all the way back there when they pulled Joseph up out of that pit and made the transaction to those Ishmaelite slave traders. Now we know what Joseph was doing. He was begging and pleading with his brothers, "Don't do this to me." And they said we wouldn't listen. And that's when Reuben, the oldest, spoke up and said, "Yep, didn't I tell you guys not to sin against that boy? Now his blood is being required of all of us." Well, Joseph's over there listening to this. He understands what they're saying and realizes two things immediately. One, these guys are sorry. Notice, all these years later, they're blaming their current problems upon what they did all the way back there. And number two, for the first time, he realizes they weren't all against me. Reuben tried to come to my rescue. You know, he is so moved by these realizations that he starts crying. He turns away where they can't see him. He regains his composure. He skips over the oldest, Reuben, and takes the second oldest, Simeon, has him bound while they watch and led off into custody. Then he allows the rest of them to take the provisions that they'd come for and to return home. Although he gives private orders to his steward as they're packing up the provisions to reinsert their silver, their money, into their sacks that they had used to purchase. Why do you do that? Well, these are the mean, greedy brothers that sold their own brother for 20 pieces of silver. It's a test. Well, off they go, and they arrive at their first night's lodging. One of them checks the luggage and finds the money returned. And he tells the others, and their hearts sink, and they say, "What is this that God is doing to us?" Then they got home. The screen door flew open. "Dad, you're not going to believe what's happened. This man has accused all of us of being spies. He took Simeon into custody and told us we've got to come and get Benjamin and take him back down in order to verify our story." And if I might update Jacob's response, "No way, Jose. You're not taking Benjamin. I've already lost Joseph. And now I've lost Simeon. And I'm not going to lose the final son of Rachel. That's not going to happen." Well, Reuben, the oldest, spoke up and tried to plead with his father and even said, "You can take my two boys and kill him if I don't get him back to you safely." But Jacob's having none of it. He was too deeply grieved at the loss of Joseph. And so they give up. They go on about their business, go back to their families, their homes, and carry on their daily activity. And once again, the provisions get low, and Jacob reassembles them. So you're going to have to go back to Egypt. They said, "Dad, we're not going if you don't let us take Benjamin." The man said, "Don't show your faces back down here unless you bring this boy to verify your story." And Jacob hit the ceiling. He was mad. He was upset. "Why did you tell this man that you had a brother back here? Did your mother ever say anything like that to you? Talk too much? You don't have to divulge everything." And they said, "Well, how did we know if we told him we had a brother, he'd make us go get him?" Well, this time Judah spoke up, sounding very sensible and reasonable. He said, "Dad, look, I will take full responsibility for the safety of the lad. You can do whatever you want to do to me. I'll make certain that he gets back to you, and I'll stand good for it. Take full responsibility." Well, by this point, they're back into trouble. You've got all of these children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a bunch of people, 60 or so. And they've got to have provisions. They've got to have food. And so Jacob basically says, "All right, if I go to my grave, so be it. Go ahead." So they take the money to purchase more. They take the money that was returned before and load up provisions for the trip and hurry back down into Egypt. When they arrive at the governmental distribution facility, this time they receive most disconcerting instructions. "You are to proceed to the private residence of the prime minister." Now that shook them up. They thought, okay, something fishy here. We're going to be attacked. All of our money and animals stolen, made slaves. What's going on here? As they come to the home of Joseph, the steward greets them, and they very quickly say, "Sir, the last time we were here, we purchased supplies and we paid for them, but when we left town, that money had been returned, but that's not our fault. We paid." So there is the answer to Joseph's question, are these men still greedy and covetous? And so the steward reassured them, oh, your God must be blessing you. We got your money. Everything's good. Well, Joseph came home for the noon meal. He walked in among those brothers, and they bowed down before him, just like the dream predicted they would. The first words out of his mouth, how's your dad? Is he still alive? First interest he's shown in that. They said, Dad is alive and well. And then he saw Benjamin. Is this the brother of whom you spoke? They said, this is him. And he choked out a few words, God be merciful to you, my son, something like that. Then he turned around, left the room, and cried like a baby. So moved after all these years at the sight of his little brother. Regained his composure. Egyptians would not sit and eat with non-Egyptians, but he gave orders for all of them to be well fed and orders for Benjamin to have 5 times as much food heaped on his plate as the others. In the meantime, they loaded up their livestock with the necessary provisions. This time, Joseph told his steward, I want you to take my silver chalice and I want you to insert it into the luggage of the youngest of these men without any of them knowing about it. And then send them on their way. All of that took place, and the brothers left town. When they reached the city limits, they must have breathed a sigh of relief. We're going to make it. But Joseph sent out an entourage in hot pursuit and said, when you overtake their caravan, make this speech. How dare you treat my master the way you've treated him when he's been so good to you, as to steal from him? Then you implement a search. When you find my silver chalice, you take that individual into custody. Tell the rest of them, go home. We don't want you here. Great plan, right? So the steward heads out in hot pursuit, overtakes the caravan, makes the speech. How dare you mistreat? And they're like, we didn't do anything. Go ahead, search us. Now, that was before Miranda didn't have to have a search warrant or anything. And so they began searching, starting with the oldest, work their way down through the luggage. They come to Benjamin's sack, and horror of horrors, there is the chalice. He is taken into custody, and they head back into town. Well, now, what are these brothers going to do? You're going to go home and face Dad? So they just meekly follow behind, and that brings them back into the presence of Joseph, who didn't want to see him again, but he keeps up the charade. How dare you treat me the way? Well, they hadn't stolen that chalice. It was all a ruse. Once again, Judah stepped up to the plate and said, Sir, please don't be angry with us. I need to explain some things to you. We had another brother, and we lost him, and it nearly killed our dad. Okay, there for the first time, Joseph now knows why Jacob didn't come looking for him. He thought he was dead. His heart must have instantly softened toward his father. Well, after Judah explains all of that, it is clear to Joseph that these brothers are changed men. These are not the younger men that mistreated him and sold him into slavery. These are men who have matured. And by the way, they offered themselves in place of Benjamin if he would let them get Benjamin back home to dad. And remember, he's only a stepbrother to them. Joseph's full-blooded. Well, that's it. Joseph can stand no more. He is so moved that he bursts out crying in front of them. He gives orders for the room to be cleared of all the Egyptian personnel. They all leave, and you can imagine these guys standing there, and here's this high Egyptian government official, and he's having a nervous breakdown or something in their presence, bawling and crying. And so he turns to them and he says, fellas, it's me, your brother, Joseph. And it's clear they don't believe him. He has to repeat it. And I guess it began to set in. And he gives this incredible speech in chapter 45, full of faith and confidence and trust in God, and basically makes the point to them that God, I can now see that God arranged all of this so that I would be here where I am, in the position I am, so that we would be able to perpetuate our family line, and I would be able to provide provisions for the entire family. So I don't hold this against you. Isn't that incredible? All those years of pent-up resentment and emotion and anger, and it just like boom, went out of him. He said, okay, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. Now that was tied to an understanding of who God is and what God was doing providentially in his life. Is God working providentially in your life? He certainly wants to. Well, do you remember he loaded them up and he said, I want you to go back and tell Dad what's happened. And then I want you to get him to come on. Move on down here. I'll take care of everybody. Pharaoh even provided what we would call moving vans. Because when he heard what was going on, somebody told him that, man, Joseph is freaking out in there and screaming or whatever. And he looked into it. And he said, hey, I'll help you get your dad and everybody down here. In fact, he deeded prime real estate in Goshen for the Israelites to inhabit. And so they went back home. Dad, you're not going to believe this, but Joseph's actually alive. In fact, he is the prime minister of the Egyptian empire. And I think his reaction is something like, yeah, right. They had to talk long and hard to convince that old man. And finally, when they provided enough detail, he said, okay, you've convinced me. I believe you. Let's go. And they loaded up that family, as I told you. I think the total was 70, but there were 4 already down there, Joseph and his family. So over 60 people, all those descendants. And they loaded them all up and their provisions and just literally exited Palestine and moved down into Egypt. And there Joseph was permitted a very few, I would say, short years with his father. His father was aged at that point anyways. And he got to have some time, probably trying to reclaim his childhood, don't you imagine? You can't do that. It's gone. It's gone. And the day came when Jacob died, and Joseph had his body embalmed according to Egyptian funeral technology. How about that? Had him mummified. And the funeral itself lasted over a month. And Joseph received permission from Pharaoh to return the body to Palestine. And so a considerable funeral procession took them all the way back there. And there, Jacob's body was placed in the family entombment cave, the cave of Machpelah. When everybody got returned to Egypt and settled back in, the brothers gathered without Joseph and said, now we're going to get it. Joseph's going to seek vengeance on us. So they sought an audience with their famous brother, came into his presence, and they said, Joseph, Dad told us before he died that he wanted us to come to you after his death and to ask you in his name to forgive us for what we did to you. That touched Joseph. It moved him. It hurt him, I suppose. He wept when they said that. And he said, fellas, I told you that I don't hold this against you. Oh, you meant to hurt me, but God meant it for good. And I told you, I'm going to take care of you and your little ones. And the Bible says he comforted his brothers with those words. Isn't that incredible? What a great man. Here's a fellow that we really need to hold up to our young people in their teen years and before so they can see what they can do when they stay with God and his will. Joseph was 110 years old when he himself died. His body was also mummified. He gave these instructions in his will. He said, God promised our forefathers that he's going to give us the land of Canaan. So when that day comes, I want my body disinterred from Egypt and transported to the promised land and reinterred. See that faith, confidence in God's promises? And that was fulfilled in the last chapter of Joshua, many, many years later. Well, we have 65 books to go tomorrow. It's a good thing we're having a potluck because we'll need the nourishment. Let's close, though, by considering Joseph if he lived here today. Would he be a Christian? Yeah. He would be baptized for the remission of sins. He would have obeyed the gospel plan of salvation, faith, repentance, oral confession, immersion in water to be cleansed of sin by the blood of Christ. He would have done all that. And he would have lived the Christian life. And even if he'd been mistreated, I guess, by neighbors and friends and relatives, he would be faithful and live life the way he ought to live it, the way we ought to live it. So God is giving us here an incredible illustration, an example. Romans 15:4. These things are written for our learning, that through patience and comfort of the Scriptures we might have hope. And notice the way Paul put that, referring primarily to, if not exclusively, to the Old Testament, when he wrote to Timothy and said, these Scriptures will reprove you, they will rebuke you, they will exhort you, and enable you to be corrected and to live properly the Christian life. So, man, we need to fill our hearts and minds with these narratives throughout the Bible that show real people. Notice, these are not Star Wars, Harry Potter type mythological stories. These are real people. They really lived. And they really experienced these things. And we've been given an inspired, accurate account of what took place in their lives. And all of that should bolster our spirits and our determination to live faithful to God and to be what we need to be, and to urge our family and our friends to do the same. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation this evening, it remains open for you as we stand together and sing this song.